Invite you to reimagine our educational system as one that serves every child in ways that transform neighborhoods, communities, the state of North Carolina, and the country overall. An education system that values the culture and heritage of its students. An education system that develops the mind, heart, and body of children in ways that are productive, human-centric, and whole. Reimagine a fully funded educational system that not only produces the best and brightest our country has to offer, but one that produces the best and brightest despite a child's race, class, and/or gender. One that serves all children equitably. Reimagine a state superintendent who understands the significant strides we can make once we lead with Leandro. Welcome to the Lead with Leandro Town Hall. My name is Kelly Easton, and I proudly serve as the Executive Director for Action for Equity, a grassroots education policy advocacy organization fighting to cultivate a community-wide culture here in Winston-Salem, Forsyth County, where equity in education proudly prevails. Unfortunately, we learned last night that candidate Catherine Truitt is unable to participate this evening due to unforeseen circumstances. We will, however, continue to move forward with the moderated Q&A with North Carolina State Superintendent candidate Jen Mangrum. But first up, we will hear from a few of our co-laborers in this work, starting with our very own Forsyth County Association of Educators President, Val Young.
Thank you, Kelly. From funding for classified staff to doing what's right for our students and our families, here in Forsyth County, we know that we haven't always done what's right by children, but we are working really hard to correct our mistakes. But until we vote representatives in the General Assembly that truly value education and truly value the people in service of education and value people in our underserved population, we will continue to have the problems and the issues that we have now. Nothing will change until we change what's going on in our General Assembly. Please, I ask every person to vote for pro-public education people like our Dr. Mangrum to change things in Raleigh so that our underserved children they need. Thank you.
Thank you, Val, for continuing to fight for our educators, our children, and families here in Forsyth County. And next up, we're going to hear from Janice Ramirez, the Executive Director for ISLA and a member of Every Child North Carolina.
Hi, my name is Janice Ramirez, and I'm the Executive Director of ISLA. Our mission is to build community and leadership. Our mission is to build community and leadership through Spanish immersion and cultural immersion programs. ISLA is part of Every Child NC Coalition because we strongly believe in changing the inequities that exist within our systems. It is important that we put leaders in place that will fight for the rights of not only our students that are in traditional classes, but also our students that receive English language services, special education services, and that we're really truly serving our children the right way. It is disturbing that still 20 years later, we continue to have the same inequities that Leandro had to fight for 20 years ago. So I hope that with this conversation, we're able to really put leaders in place that should be leading with Leandro. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. So doing the right thing after we've done everything else is not only counterproductive, but Black, brown, and low-income students and families, it has been oppressive and destructive to all marginalized communities throughout the state of North Carolina. The weight of liberation falls on all of us who consider democracy worth the fight. Providing a sound and basic education has always mattered because Black children indeed matter. Now we will hear from Fonte Coleman as he shares his experience in North Carolina public schools and why more than ever we need everyone on board with the fight for a sound and basic education for every child in our state.
Our schools now are more segregated than they were a decade ago. And with COVID now, it's accelerated that even more. And we about to feel it. I grew up in Robertson County, which is, historically, to my knowledge, always been one of the poorest counties in North Carolina. When I was 8, my mother moved us to Greensboro, to Guilford County, because I think she specifically knew that I would have a chance at a better education if I was in a bigger city, and, I thank her for doing that, but it shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't be, if you have the resources to move, every child should have the same access, no matter where you are. Your location shouldn't determine the opportunities that you have. Coming from Robertson County, moving to Greensboro, and going to the middle school I went to, it looked like a college. It was night and day. It had nothing to do with the teachers. These inequalities have just grown even further. As a black kid, just as a black person, you learn very quickly, as it applies to education, it applies to everything. You always learn that there's 2 sets of rules. There's the rules, and then there are the rules for you. Whenever I hear this is a great school, I always have to ask, all right, well, who did y'all poll on that? Because it could be a great school for you, for your kids. It might not be a great school for my kids. I can remember in particular, 9th grade. I'm in all these academically gifted classes, majority white kids. There's a couple of black kids, a couple of us in there. It was literally, I would see them in the morning, like my homies, I'd see them in the morning on the bus, and then by the time we got to school, I would not see them again until football practice. And, we talk about the segregation and the tracking. You can have 2 students in the same school, same teachers, same everything, and have 2 completely different experiences. I can remember probably the first time I ever was asked, what's wrong? It was a black teacher. They would ask, like, yo, you've been acing all the tests. Like, what's happening? What's wrong? You was my 100 man. Like, what's going on? When we talk about racism, all these things, I definitely think that we need more teachers who are sympathetic to what these kids are going through at home. It's always the poorer kids that get the short end of the stick. That's the story of our country. This country always does the right thing, but only after they try everything else first. And so now I think in this era of COVID, they have an opportunity to, where, the legislators, the administrators, all the, the powers that be, you have no choice but to do the right thing. Click the link and learn how you can address inequalities in our schools and in your community.
Thank you. So next, we're going to go into our moderated discussion with Jen Mangrum, our North Carolina State Superintendent candidate, and it will be moderated by Letha Muhammad. Letha is the Director of Education Justice Alliance, EJA, based in Raleigh, North Carolina. As director, Letha is working to advance the organization's impact on dismantling the school to prison and the school to deportation pipeline in her local school district, Wake County Public Schools, and in other districts across the state. She believes that one of the most effective ways to dismantle the school to prison pipeline is to work with parents and families that are directly impacted by this issue. As such, her work includes engagement and leadership training with parents, students, and community members to ensure they know their rights and how to advocate for themselves and their students. working with other community stakeholders and organizations to bring awareness to the issue of school pushout and the criminalization of Black and Brown students is another one of her key roles as director. Letha represents EJA on the coordinating committee of the National Dignity in Schools campaign and serves as the co-chair of their fundraising finance committee. Letha is also a member of Muslims for Social Justice, MSJ, and on the steering committee of the Movement to End Racism and Islamophobia, MERI. She is a wife and a mother of 2 school-aged children and 1 young adult. So thank you, Letha. And now I'll turn it over to you.
Hey, thank you, Kelly. I appreciate the introduction and thank you for having me here. I'm excited to join this conversation, this important conversation, and happy to introduce our candidate. Dr. Jen Mangrum is a native North Carolinian and the daughter of 2 elementary school teachers. Jen studied elementary education at UNC Wilmington before obtaining her master's in early childhood education from East Carolina University. Jen spent 14 years teaching elementary in Onslow and Guilford counties, and then continued on to receive her PhD in curriculum instruction from UNC Greensboro. In 2004, Jen started the elementary education program at NC State University, and she is now a professor at UNCG, preparing future teachers in the School of Education. And she is, as we all know while we're here, she's a candidate for State Superintendent of Public Instructions. So join me in welcoming Dr. Jen Mangrum to our conversation tonight.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll just hop right on into these questions. And, you know, as our audience knows, and even us participants, you know, our theme for the night tonight is leading with Leandro. We recognize that our state has failed us for over 25 years now with not fulfilling the promise of the Leandro case. We know earlier this year via the West Ed report that was petitioned by the judge in the case that there was, you know, recommendations that came out about how North Carolina could finally fulfill its mission, its constitutional mandate, really, providing a sound basic education. And so all of our questions tonight will be centered around that theme. So Dr. Mangrum, my first question for you tonight is, one of the biggest recommendations from the West Ed report is to reform our school funding system. What features or reforms would you like to see made to our school funding system if you were elected?
Thank you, Letha, and it's Jen. Just call me Jen. And I first want to say that Kelly's introduction was so good about reimagining education for every child that, I mean, the hair was standing up on my arms. I align with everything she said, and I'm going to work so hard towards that. And then Fonte, I think it was named Coleman. I mean, what a great video, because, you know, he just gets it. And, you know, I've been in Guilford County and I know exactly what he's talking about. I was running through the schools in my head, but, you know, every child should have an equal experience in schools. And the fact that he knew that he had a different experience than people he rode on the bus with, you know, that's really crazy. So you said, what features would I like to see?
Or reforms, either, whichever word appeals to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, and I know it sounds simplistic, but we have to demand that the General Assembly fully fund the West Ed recommendations. 40%, which would mostly target high need schools, populations that have been marginalized, and 40% only gets them to a sound basic education. And I don't know about you, you have 3 kids, but I don't want my kids just to have a sound basic education. I want them to have a world-class education. So we need to demand that 40% come. And right now, I don't have hopes of that unless we can turn over the General Assembly. And I'd like more. My opponent often says, you can't throw money at the problem. I don't want to throw money at anything. I want to use it intentionally I want to use it for specific purposes. And I think that we can really advance our schools. I guess the things I'd like to see is if we can demand that money and it comes, that we target particular schools that are in high need, that we know where that money needs to be and that it goes to the right places. I think that there needs to be some flexibility in how that money is spent once it goes to those districts. You know, Fonte talked about Robeson County, right? And if they were to get those funds, they know what they need and can, you know, really push them ahead of time. I'd also like the money to be stable, so you don't just get it one time and you don't know what you're going to get next year. Like, we have to have a long range plan where schools know what they can expect and how they can set goals. And that's the last thing. I think that we need to monitor these goals as we go along. And the money as well, right? We're not going to throw it away. We're going to make sure that the money is being spent in ways that is helping us reach our goals. So I think those are what's most important. But I also want to say, I wrote down lots of notes about, someone said fight for children's rights. I can't remember, it might've been Kelly. I am going to fight. And I think that's really important because it's been in the news that my opponent says that means I can't work across the aisle. I think Martin Luther King was a fighter, right? Rosa Parks was a fighter. Fighting doesn't mean physical violence. Fighting means you keep at it. You're a dog with a bone. We are going to keep talking about these hard conversations until things get done. That's what I mean by fight. And I really think we collectively, I'm so excited to know about your organization, we need to collectively fight for our children and that they get the funds they deserve.
I appreciate that. And so I always like to sum up or pull out nuggets of what I heard, right, that really struck me when I'm doing events like this. And what I heard was, right, that we need to demand that our legislatures do what they're supposed to do, right, what they're elected to do. But also, once that funding comes, we need to have a mechanism in place, right, to assess the how it's doing, right? So because you can't just do something and then not go back and make sure what it's supposed to do is you have to make sure it's been done. So I appreciate hearing those two comments from you. Our next question, you know, one of the most provocative findings of the West Ed report was that North Carolina has moved backwards since the past recession. It's, you know, stated that North Carolina is now further away from meeting its constitutional obligation to provide every child with an opportunity for a sound basic education, which, to your point, right, we actually want more than that. But if we're just talking about what our Constitution says, right, we're even further away now. So if in the Leandro decision more than 20 years ago, right, it said that a sound basic education was what was required. And do you still agree with that assessment, right? That we're still, even though we know we're further behind, that we still deserve at least that as a bare minimum?
Absolutely. I started teaching in 1987. I moved to Guilford County in 1989 from rural Eastern North Carolina. And when I went to Guilford County, there were no teaching jobs. I had a master's degree and 2 years experience. And that was because in the 80s and 90s, we were making progress. We were the first high poverty Southern state to reach above national norms, as well as make progress towards closing the achievement gap. The only state in the 90s that was able to do that. We did that because Governor Hunt and our legislatures put in intentional, sustained investment. And I think we need to say investment because you hear people talking about funding. You know, funding sounds like, well, we'll give you money to do what no, invest in our kids and invest in every kid. I do think that the past 10 years, we have gone backwards because of mismanagement, because of lack of investment by our leadership. I don't know if everyone listening knows this, but in 2016, after Hillary Clinton lost, I thought, you know what, Obama was right. Politics is not a spectator sport. I got to get involved. And I planned on driving people to the polls. And I laughed because that's what I planned to do. But instead, I ran against Senator Phil Berger. So I took on a little more. But it's exactly that reason, because for 10 years, I watched our schools. I'd been teaching, we came along, right? I'm not saying we were where we needed to be, but we were moving in the right direction. And after 10 years of trying to dismantle public education, we have slid backwards incredibly. I would say that I think the intention of our Republican leadership is to dismantle public education and privatize it and make what they call it, market, make it a fair market system. When you do that, you know who's going to lose out. It's all the children you're thinking about. They're going to be left behind. What happens is, if you don't fund schools or invest in schools, if you don't pay teachers, if you don't give resources, if schools are overcrowded, if buildings are crumbling, then people leave and teachers leave. And that's going to cause just a complete fallout of our public education system. The opposite of that is we need to invest in recruit teachers and teachers of color. We need to give them professional development and mentorship, because you don't come out of a college program like I do, like I prepare students, knowing everything. It takes growth. We need to invest in our teachers, invest in our schools, and invest in our kids, because we know when you're intentional, like Governor Hunt was in the 80s and 90s, that we will do great things. So, that's what I think we need to be doing. We slacked off. We need to turn around and go forward.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate that word investment, right? You're right in alignment with some of our questions. So we recognize that the West Ed report calls for a substantial new investment, there's that word again, right, in early childhood programs. And we recognize that as a state superintendent, early childhood falls outside of your purview, but in your own, career, right, and education, it doesn't, right? So I think you would have something to bear. So what would you do to facilitate children's transitioning into K through 12 schools from our pre-K or early childhood system if you were elected as superintendent?
You're singing my song, Letha. You're singing my song. Yeah. So my master's is in early childhood. And we know that investing in early childhood pays off in the long run. One of the things I've been talking about across the state is the first 1,000 days of a child's life. Actually, a doctor came to see me at UNCG from Thailand, who'd been to Finland. I know this is a long story, but they said, go see Jen. And he said the first 1,000 days is critical to a baby's brain development and to their potential as a learner. It's also when they're the most vulnerable. So we're talking from 0 to 2. Right? And right now, our early childhood is meeting the needs of 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, and not all of them. So we need to work on that. But I want us to think about babies. We know, the research says, when you invest in those first 1,000 days, you're going to have healthier children, a healthier society. They're going to have a better workforce. Children are going to be more productive. And also the big thing is there's going to be an equality of opportunity when early babies get the help they need. One of the things I talk about is a program in Durham. Her name's Ginger Young, and it's called Book Babies. And she's been doing it for 5 years. And I think Winston's doing it now too. I think they borrowed it from Durham. But at 6 months old, she has 80 families, all around the poverty line. She has bilingual families as well. And she sends in 10 books when the baby's 6 months old, and a literacy specialist who says, this is how you engage in these books. Here are nursery rhymes, here are songs, and help the parents understand how language helps phonemic awareness and phonics. She goes back in 6 more months and does it again. Well, the first group just went to kindergarten. They have 100 books in their personal library, and the research shows they were far more prepared than their counterparts. That obviously is not something I can do, right? But what I can do is advocate for it. I can work for public-private partnerships. I can try to set up infrastructures where we think about our most youngest and vulnerable, because waiting till they're 3 or 4 doesn't make sense if we know their brain is developing 0 to 2. And just because we did it for the last 50 years doesn't mean that we can't start thinking younger and sooner, particularly the children who their zip codes are already predicting their outcomes. Let's get in there early and support the families.
Can I tell you, you lit up, right, as you talked about this subject. So I could tell it's near and dear to your heart, right? So we appreciate that. You also said a word, right, opportunity, right, which leads us into another question we had for you tonight, which is we recognize that North Carolina's Black students have suffered a persistent and large opportunity gaps, and even increasingly more also our English language learner students as well. What measures will you take specifically to close the opportunity gaps and to help Black students as well as English language learner students succeed? And we're very intentional about naming that gap opportunity, right? Because for so many years, and you know, I'm going off script a little bit, right? Achievement is, you know, was this idea that this achievement gap was the thing that was holding Black students back, right? And so I really appreciate the framing of opportunity as the thing that is missing, right? And so, you know, what is your response to ensuring that Black and Brown students succeed and that opportunity gap closes?
Yeah, and Fonte talked about opportunity, right? He had classes that his friends didn't. So of course he's going to achieve differently because he had opportunities that some didn't, and only 2 though in his class of color. So I guess what you need to know is I am committed to Black and Brown students achieving. I understand that I am a white woman who has been privileged and have the oppression has actually benefited me. I get that, whether I intended it or not. But I am committed to every child. That's why I got excited about what I wrote down. Every child succeeding. One of the first things I've done is I've got thought partners around me. And I said that, like, I want every child to succeed. You know, let's talk about our vision. And my vision starts with every child, and this is my word, Letha, you're gonna love it, flourishing. I think every child should flourish because flourish means to me their well-being in addition to their academics, right? It's not just that they score on a test. And so we came up with this vision, and then we thought, well, how do we make that happen? And we know that we have to support them emotionally, physically, socially, academically. But the next step is where it comes in when you said, what measures or something would you take? We have 5 core values. Let's see if I can remember them all. But they start with equity, because equity is the foundation for us, for all children to flourish. So the first thing is we have to have challenging, creative, culturally sustaining curriculum or instruction where kids are challenged. If you go to uncgtlc.org, you'll see I co-founded the UNCG STEM Teacher Leader Collaborative. And we work in high poverty schools with engineering, elementary schools with engineering. Our kids flourish. The problem is the teachers will only do that after testing, right? No, we need to have creative, integrated, you know, culturally sustaining instruction for everyone. And then that would also include, you know, the difficult courses. We need to recruit, employ, support, retain teachers of color because we know that impacts our students and helps them succeed and have higher achievement. Along those same lines, we need to provide all teachers with the support so that they have the capacity to teach children from diverse populations. We have to help them be able to do that in ways that are successful. The curriculum is the 4th one. Right now, there is a 4th grade standard that says our students will value our monuments in North Carolina, and there's a link to the Confederate statue in front of the Capitol, a link. I teach elementary social studies, and so this summer we saw that. My students were floored. And it didn't say that they'll think critically about it, it said they'll value it, right? So we've got to change our curriculum, and I'm excited to know that that's supposed to happen next year. And under my leadership, it's going to flourish. And then finally, I think you'll like this one, Letha, because you already told me you're listening and you're picking out words. We have to have hard, courageous conversations about race and how it impacts students in the classroom. And that's going to start with me at DPI. We're going to have hard conversations. And I'm not saying I know everything, because I don't. That's why we have to keep having them. I'm going to listen and learn and listen some more. But once we do it, we want to expand it. So all of North Carolina, all of our school districts are having those conversations. Because if we just pretend it doesn't happen, then we're not going to address it. So I don't know if that's what you meant exactly, but those are the measures that me and my thought partners, I call them, because, and it's a diverse group of people who sit down with me, because when and if I win, I want to be ready to go. And we have been thinking about this, and it so aligns with your organization, all your organizations. You're in like 10. It sounds like you're chaired all of them. But I am committed to every child.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate you lifting equity, you know, as your number one thing. And I think when we think about opportunity gaps, right, and the ways in which those opportunity gaps impact Black and Brown students, right, at the core of that is inequity, right? And so if you're going to lead from an equitable place, I think you could get at dismantling or removing those opportunity gaps. So in 2016, the state abandoned its district and school transformation model of supporting struggling schools, right, and districts, and instead opted in for a model called innovative school districts, whereby control of struggling schools is turned over to an outside school operator. Do you think this is the right model for supporting underperforming schools? And if not, what would be an idea that you would have to support them instead in a different way?
Okay, I'm going to back up again just a little bit, because it hit me when you were talking that you said Black and Brown students, and in the last question, and while Black and Brown students will all benefit from what I said, our Brown students, those students need some special opportunities as well. I put my student teachers in Siler City Elementary School, which is a dual immersion school. And I really value that model, because they spend half their day in English world, half their day in Spanish world. And when the little English kids were in Spanish, they were a little bit lost, you know, but they were hanging in there, and then vice versa. And so it kind of equals the playing field, right? That they both honored each other's culture, and they both were learners. And, you know, it didn't have a hierarchical, it's like we're at the same place. I met two of my students who were student teachers there, Maria and Jasmine Ruiz. They may be listening. And they've really helped me think about this too. They've talked about professional development. We have got to have more professional development, particularly for non-Spanish speaking teachers. We need to have curriculum that lifts up, just like I said, for our students of color, but also for our Spanish speakers. We need to hire more personnel that are bilingual, or that understand the culture and celebrate the culture. And so I wanted to say that, because I really just focused in general. And I think that our ESL students have some special needs. In fact, you mentioned, someone at the beginning was mentioning like deportation. I had a student teacher who had a child who was misbehaving, elementary school, 2nd or 3rd grade. And she said, what do I do? And I said, well, let me come and, you know, see what's happening. And he'd always been well behaved. And I'm telling you, he's rolling around the room. He's throwing things. Well, when we get to the bottom of it, his father had been deported, you know. And so if she hadn't taken the time, or we hadn't taken the time to find that out, and then immediately, and this is something else we need a nurse in every school, a social worker, a guidance counselor, a school psychologist, because the teacher can't handle all that, right? We have to have a comprehensive effort. So I probably don't remember the question you actually asked.
I'm gonna ask you again. We could go back to that. But I was snapping, right? When you're speaking my language, when you talk about ensuring that we have guidance counselors, that we have nurses, that we have psychologists, right? That we recognize, right, that across our state that we don't have those resources in our schools in a way that can really help young people. So I appreciate you naming that. Yes. So here's the question again.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes, no worries. Do you think in terms of the current model, right, which is the innovative school district, do you think that's the right model for supporting underperforming schools?
No. So one of the models that I've been most excited about, and all of these things I'm researching, right? And I'm thinking to myself, once we knew our vision and our core values, so what does that look like structurally? And the ISD, the Innovative School District, did not work. Epic fail. And we used to have a division of supporting schools, transformation. And I don't know where I am with that. And I'm thinking we also had regional RESA. So those things are playing through my head. But I've also heard of community schools. And community schools are when the entire community takes ownership of that school. It's a hub. And they have things like healthcare on site. They have extended learning, and not just for children and adults. They have more opportunities for our students, and industry is supporting it. I would love to see us, if we have low performing schools or schools that have been deemed to have to restart, if we could get this community model. I'm pretty much a salesperson, if you can't tell, but I'd go knock on those doors and I would say, we want this school to succeed. It's in Robeson County. You're in Robeson County. You know, help us create a school that supports the parents, the families, the children beyond academics, right? After school care, but after school care that's enriching, that, you know, really brings out the best. So in my mind, I think that's one place I'd like to go to help these schools and transform them.
I appreciate that, because what I'm hearing as you talk, right, is this idea that my organization pushes is like relationship-centered schools, right? Yeah. One that recognizes the whole child, right, and then creates space and opportunity and has things in place to build up positive relationships, right? So I like that. Now, thinking about teaching, right, and recognizing that part of your work is in teacher prep, right? And you spoke a little bit earlier about what makes a good teacher. But what would, in your mind, what are some of the correct characteristics that make a great teacher? And then as state superintendent, how would you work to ensure every classroom is then led by a great teacher?
So I'm not copying you, Letha, but you were right. A great teacher builds relationships with her students and families, or his students and families. My students will tell you, I stress that over and over again. And from a theory perspective, it's because you want kids to identify as learners, and you want them to feel a sense of belonging in that classroom. We've all been in classrooms where either because of the teacher or the content, we thought, I don't belong here, right? I don't do physics, I don't do math. So teachers have to build those relationships so students identify and feel like, I can do this. Lisa Delpit's a leading African-American scholar in education, and she says, children don't learn from you, they learn for you. And so I think a great teacher starts with those relationships. In fact, when I described the student that was rolling on the floor, you know, that's what we needed to do. We need to go build a relationship and find out why, not punish him or, you know, give him silent lunch. We need to know what's at the heart of this. I think that's the most important. I tell my students probably the next thing is that a teacher can plan challenging, creative, you know, culturally relevant instruction. And she can't do that if she doesn't know her students. She also, or he, and they also can't do that if we're just set on this testing model that we're on. We've got to get off that bridge and start thinking about the well-being of our children. If they are good at planning, hopefully they can implement it in ways that children feel successful, that they value what they're learning, and they feel like they can do it. And then also she has to be able to assess it. Right now, we're on this crazy iStation assessment or computers assessment. No, the teacher needs to assess. And it needs to be formative. And for people that don't know, formative assessment means I'm going to do something where I learn about the student, and that's going to help me move that student forward. Or I learn something about the way I'm teaching that I got to change. It's not about grading them or evaluating them. It's how do I help them move farther, or what do I need to do differently? And that can take all kinds of forms. But if a teacher can make a relationship, plan good instruction, implement it, and then assess, we're there. But I do think the relationship piece is by far most important.
I'd have to concur as a mother of now a senior in high school and a freshman in one already that went through. The best experiences we had, right, was with teachers who were able to build long-lasting positive relationships with not only with my children, but me as the parent, right, entering the classroom. So relationships are very important in our education system. So unfortunately, I've gotten to the last one of my questions. I got one question left, and I just want to, really appreciate this conversation with you tonight, and your thought process and the way that you're thinking about leading public education in the state. So our last question, we're bringing it back to Leandro and the West Ed report. As you think about the findings in that report, West Ed, what do you think was missing, if anything?
Really good question, Letha. Thank you. And also, you just mentioned me leading. I'm leading with you, and I'm leading with Kelly, and I'm leading with Val. And this, I put myself out there to take on what we have. But this is a collective spirit that we're going to, no one person can do what we need to do, right? I guess based on what I've been saying up until now, and I could be wrong, I know it's a long report, but I don't recall specific intentional work on racism in West Ed. I think there was a lot of talk about poverty or kids with disabilities. But, James Ford, who's on the state board and has CREED, has shown us that you can control for poverty, you can control for parents' knowledge, income, but still children who are Black and brown don't have the same opportunity and achievement. And so I don't see how West Ed can't say, we also need to be working on this. And I could be wrong, but I don't recall that. And actually putting funding to it. I told you I want to have these hard conversations. Well, to get people together, it's going to take some funding too, but I'll figure that out. But we really need to address it. Again, I don't want to sound like I know everything, because I know I don't. And one of my dear friends, Justin Perry in Charlotte, said to me, one time I spoke up when I shouldn't have. Imagine that, right? I'm kind of chatty. He said, when you spoke, it's not about what you said, it's that you didn't, by speaking, you weren't acknowledging our pain. That was huge for me. I mean, just huge. So now I always try to think before I say something, and it's a hard space because I want to lead, but I also want to learn. And I'm going to have to navigate that. But, most teachers don't know that. And I'm learning it, right? So I think the West Ed report did not do us any benefit by not talking about how we can literally look specifically at race and what that does to a student's experience.
Appreciate that. And again, that was my last question. So I just really appreciate this conversation with you. And, this is Letha talk, and look forward to your leadership in the future and leading together with you. I threw me in there now. I heard you. I'm with you there. So appreciation for you. We're going to turn it over to Kelly now, and she's going to share some of the questions that our participants, our audience, have shared in the chat. Thank you.
And yes, this has been so good. I just appreciate the opportunity to be able to hear more about what you would do and your ideas and your vision for an equitable school district. And thank you. So I do have some questions here. So the first one, Who would oversee the money given if you have not been able to provide basic education up to today? What shift would be made for those same individuals to be trusted again?
I'm not really sure what they're talking about, but I'll say this. It sounds like the person is concerned about misuse of funds. And I do know that the superintendent has the authority to do audits in any and every district. And I think that's important that we do that we know where we start, right? And that hopefully the 40% will come, but that we're monitoring how it's used. So if that answers the person's question, it is under my purview to make sure that people are spending money appropriately.
Yes. Okay, yes, thank you. Okay, and so next, if failure continues for children of color in the upcoming years, what are you willing to do to ensure change? If things continue,
Yeah, I get it. They're worried that what if nothing changes, right? And what am I willing to do? Well, first of all, again, we must demand that the General Assembly fund the Leandro and then forward. I know that when you ask what if there's continuing to fail, we know that when we have the resources and when we recruit the best teachers, right, that schools improve. They've already done it before. So I'm not concerned that they won't, as long as the General Assembly does their part. Now, this is the problem. The reason I ran against Phil Berger is, as superintendent, I have no control over the budget. I have no control over how many vouchers they give away to private schools. I have no control over the number of charter schools that they keep continuing to build. Laws and budgets are out of my purview. The State Board of Education makes the policy. I'll sit on it, but I'll be one person. But what I can do and what I promise to do is to provide resources that are under my watch as DPI and remove barriers that school districts are dealing with so that students can succeed. If we get 2 years down the road and the General Assembly's done what they said they'd do and we're not making progress, then we're just going to have to regroup. But I follow the research. I mean, I have a PhD. I'm all about research. Community schools are well researched, right? Creed has really researched how race is impacting our students and has suggestions for how to change it. I've always felt teachers know what's good. The problem is these laws and rules are being made by a bunch of, white men who've never been in classrooms. And sometimes it's based on political movement of the country. This whole iStation thing, I'm not sure what started it, but to me, it must be motivated by money or power, not by what's best for kids. That's right. So what I can promise you is everything that I will lead in will have been researched and well developed and will be funded.
Yes, thank you. In conjunction with addressing the needs of students of color, there is a disproportionate referral rate of Black and Brown students to special education. How do you plan to address this?
Right. So not only special education, but disciplinary actions, right? Fewer students of color in gifted programs. So when I talked about having hard conversations around race, that's the first thing we have to do, is we have to acknowledge that this isn't just happening, right? It's not the children's fault. It's not the parents' fault. We have to literally acknowledge that we refer children differently. Right. And a lot of times it's based on race. Yeah. And once we acknowledge that, then we can look at the research too, or look at the research first, right? I'm not sure what the percentage is, but it's a extremely high number of kids that are overrepresented in EC classrooms. Yeah. And so once we look at that, we're going to need to look at, well, what instruction was happening that they got referred? Because chances are good they weren't flourishing in the classroom, and if they weren't, the teacher wasn't providing an environment where she built relationships, where she gave them creative things to do, where she had culturally sustaining curriculum that they were excited about. There's so many things we have to change, but it starts with acknowledging that race plays a role, and then if we know that, what's happening in classrooms and how do we counter that?
Absolutely, and thank you. School climate, classroom climate, like these things are very serious and they make a world of difference. So I thank you for naming that. Um, this here, I like what Jen said about Black and Brown students and making sure that they can achieve the same education and have different cultures involved in their curriculum. I would like to see teachers be open to the students uplifting instead of putting them down. We need teachers that really care. What is your response to that?
So one of the books I use at UNCG by Lisa Delpit is called Multiplication is for White People. And I use it in my graduate class, and she talks about this thing called racial smog, and it's all around us. And Black is used in a lot of negative ways, right? Like if you get blackballed, right? Or whatever, it's constantly, without even knowing it, people are surrounded by images that Black is inferior. And so when we're thinking about, what did you just ask me?
Yeah, it's let's go back here.
About them having the same education and then
so basically this person says, I would like to see the teachers be open to the students uplifting instead of putting them down. We need teachers that really care.
Exactly. And so what I think is, I don't want to say these teachers are not good people. I think they've been indoctrinated in this smog, and they've come to accept that that's how things are supposed to be, and they're not. And we have to wake them up to that. What are you experiencing? An example would be, one of my students was at an elementary school, and the teacher said, and I want to say to you, this is not an evil teacher, but she is completely unaware of the racial smog around her and how it has engulfed her. And she said, looking at the playground, look at these kids. This is the prison yard in the future, right? My student knew enough to know that teacher's got a problem. And so we addressed it with her. But what I want teachers to be able to say that without feeling shameful and know they did that, right? If we don't acknowledge it, if we act like it doesn't exist, we're not going to move forward. So I think teachers care. I just think they're not learned, that they're not acknowledging racism, and it's because who's asked them to?
Right.
Talk about it, right?
Yeah. I was on a panel a couple of weeks ago. We were discussing Priority Pre-K. That's the campaign that we're pushing here in Forsyth County. But not only just the need to, or the access of it, but also how are we preparing teachers? And the interesting thing that, and it was Dr. Ebonice Mead, the interesting thing that she shared was that, according to her study and her dissertation, she found that the majority of the schools, if not actually all of them, except for a few of the HBCUs, did not offer any type of they didn't offer any type of like racial equity in their curriculum, or the understanding of cultural bias. And so it was so I'm interested in hearing, like, what are your thoughts about that? And I think that's why we have teachers, like you said, who do not have that knowledge, don't have the understanding in the classrooms.
So my faculty at UNCG right now are tackling hard conversations about it ourselves. Because you can also think you're a scholar on it and still not recognize when it's coming out, right? And I led a seminar on Langston Hughes' Theme from English B, where the professor says, go home and write the truth about yourself and share it with me. And the professor's white, and the character in Langston Hughes' poem is Black. He says it's not an autobiography. And we talked about that, right? How does that relate to us? What are we doing with our students? What are we asking them to do? How are we relating to them? And so I know at UNCG, in my teacher ed program, we are working diligently on ourselves and also in our classrooms. But I can't say that that's being done everywhere. So I want to work with the Association of Colleges of Teacher Education. And I don't want a mandate from the General Assembly or from DPI. I want schools, and the faculties I know want to do well. And so we just need to come together. One of the things I've suggested, and this is a perfect place to talk about it, is I'd like an institute of teaching and learning where we can have best practices in professional development that brings all our great faculty from across the state and our great teachers that are already in classrooms working together. Because K-12 and universities have a dissonance, right?
Yes.
But I want to place it at Charlotte Hawkins Brown campus, who was, a prominent Black educator. It's right near Sedalia. It's a campus that the state owns, but you could go visit it, but not many people even know where it is. I'm like, what if we had an amazing institute that focused on teaching children Black and Brown, and of course, hopefully that means all kids, but specifically, what do we need to do in these, and also in literacy. I think people from out of state would come. I think we could be a shining light. And then also we could share the rich history, because we know social studies is leaving out so much, right? And so while you're here, how can we use what we have? We could use the International Civil Rights Museum. We could use Guilford College, where Quakers were part of the Underground Railroad. Of course, A&T has the experience, as well as Bennett. I understand Bennett was actually in it before A&T, if you read a little bit. So, but I would love to use an institute like that for us really to get better at meeting the needs of all of our students, and at the same time highlighting our great state.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And I think it's going to take entities or assets, these institutions like that, to be able to have an impact on the culture as well. And so we know these structural issues, these structural racism, institutional racism, part of the reason why, it continues is because there isn't anything within the power structure, to combat it, to be able to, to address it. So that is, thank you for sharing that.
Talking about schools of ed, they rarely talk together either. So we need infrastructures that bring the best together to get to this issue, right? And now state has the Friday Institute, and some places do, but if you're a smaller college or university, you don't have access. I want it to be an institute that all of North Carolina owns and has a stake in.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so now the next question, what do you see as the biggest deficit to how North Carolina teaches disability kids, and how do you plan on addressing it?
Okay, so they're not disability kids, they're kids with disabilities. That's part of our thing is we label kids. I think I didn't mention it. I've been in another thing before this. I go to Finland twice. I've been twice. I was supposed to go this year and COVID hit. They don't label any child. What they say is the child comes to you with assets and strengths and with challenges. And as the teacher, your goal, if they have challenges, is to figure out how to address them. Because once we start, I'm not going to make laws that we can't label kids, but once we do that, we've really impacted their identity and their sense of agency. And they feel less than, or not able to do as much. I guess what I would like to do is really, I never taught, I had kids with disabilities in my classroom, but I wasn't certified in special ed. And I really want to learn as much as I can about the laws and practices around special education, because I feel disconnected from that. I think that's the one, early childhood I've got, literacy in elementary school I got. But when it comes to dealing with kids with special needs, and I think it's important for me to say, I will tell you when I don't know. Like, I am not afraid to say, I need to learn more about that. And who should I go see? And people will tell me usually. I do know that our students with disabilities are often pulled out on missed opportunities for specials or for physical activity. We've got to figure out a way to address their needs that isn't stigmatizing, but is building on their assets and allows them to have a full experience in school around their well-being.
Yes, inclusivity is critical if we're going to move forward in a way that is truly equitable. And here, Janice says, we need to come from a strengths-based approach.
Yeah, I believe that. Assets,
Yes. And so another question here, mental health is an area of need, in need of support for students. What are your thoughts about how schools can support students with mental health wellness?
So I'm going to get a little personal here. My father was a Marine, served in 3 wars. After 2 terms of Vietnam, he got his GED and then an associate's and then a college degree and became a 4th grade teacher. And he chose a school high in poverty, predominantly kids of color. I was about 8. So I always say that was my first conversation about the inequities, you know, when you have 2 schools miles apart. My mom was a kindergarten teacher, the love of my life. She fought for Buddy Martin, who had cerebral palsy, to be in the public schools. And he became a pediatrician. So I had these great elementary teachers that you mentioned earlier as models. But when I was 14, my dad started yelling for me. I run in the kitchen and my mom, sometimes I'm better than others. I'm getting ready to cry. My mom was in the middle of a massive heart attack at 49. I grabbed her, held her. She fell out of the chair. She died that morning in my arms. But what's so remarkable about that is my father left with the paramedics and I was the only child at home. And not knowing what to do, I walked to school. And I walked to school because I knew Mrs. Travis and Mrs. Warren were going to hug me, hopefully help me figure this out. I thought they could make it all better, which they couldn't. But I was a child in trauma. And I think I experienced trauma for at least a year. And my father, that was like PTSD for him. That was too much. So he quit working. We ended up living in poverty after that. And I ended up taking care of him because of drugs and alcohol. But what I learned was, looking back, no one suggested counseling, never saw a social worker. It was kind of like expected to pick up, you know, just pick up and move on. And that's what my dad would say. We got to move on. If you don't move on, you're moving backwards. And, you know, kids like Jen at 14 need supports.
Yes.
And now I have them, right? Now I see someone. That's why I can talk about this. But I didn't have it as a kid. And a whole year of my schoolwork shows it, if you look at my grades from that 1 year. So I have an amazing soft spot for kids that are dealing with trauma or, you know, all kinds of issues, right? Even if it's something like issues with friends, to kids, that's important.
Yes.
And that's why I wanted to be a teacher, because I was like, I want to be the teacher that was there for me. I want to be the teacher like my mom and dad. I think if you talk to any of my students, some of my 3rd graders are pulling for me now, you know, and that was a long time ago. But we have got to put mental health services into our schools. People need access to it. And to think that you can just forget about it or push it down, at some point it's going to come up. And for me, it was at age 49, which you can imagine. I mean, that's about the time I decided to run for office and do all these crazy things. But, you know, you can't ever just let things sit. And I think that too many kids, that's all they have. And they need support groups, and they need school psychologists, and they need nurses. And a lot of times their physical pain is really a mental pain, right? And then if we get these community schools, we can bring in faith groups and support groups and other kids who've gone through it. I mean, that was one of the things I remember the most. I'm pouring my hearts out to you two, but I don't remember ever knowing a child. And at 14, I felt like a child who'd lost a parent. Like, I felt so isolated and that nobody knew what it was like on Mother's Day not to have a mom. You know, I still get that way a little bit. So anyway, I threw out the personal there, but it's because that's what drives me to do this. This is why I'm not my opponent. This is why I'm the person to lead this. And I think God has brought me to this place right now where we're going to make great change. We're going to move from a pandemic tragedy, somebody said this earlier, to a post-pandemic transformation. We're going to use this as an opportunity to say, we have seen what we've done. It is not good for our kids. Anyone who has a 20-year-old, you have a high schooler. I don't know if your child suffers from anxiety, but my girls, and I think part of it is we have tested them and held them competitive and expected them to sit for hours for years.
Yeah.
Where is the creativity? Where's the joy? Where's the art? Where's the curiosity? That's what we need to put back in schools, so that kids want to be there and don't feel like their goal is to be the best or to compete against someone. That's a lot, but mental health's important. There you go.
Yes, thank you. Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for just being, open and about your story.
I'm pretty open. Yeah.
Yes. I once again just deeply appreciate that and all that you shared, because trauma is a real thing, and I know that coming out of this pandemic, we have no idea what's going on, in the homes of many of our children. And so we need to be prepared. So everything that you shared is really important. And so we'll wrap up with this question, which really just honestly brings together so much of what you said. I am a strong proponent of for community schools as well. I think that is how we're going to make the greatest impact, just as a society, even like on our economy, on everything. But this question here, how will you ensure that there is a strong focus on authentic family and community engagement with a strong state level division office and adequate resources?
Nice. I was looking back at what I wrote earlier because you said transforming neighborhoods, communities. You kept getting bigger, right? You also said mind, heart, and body, which I think we've talked about as well. I love the idea of what I heard them say in the question, or you said, about how am I going to create an office or a responsibility around that. I haven't thought about it too much. I mean, I know it's important and I want community schools. I also think that if we're going to strengthen communities and family engagement, it can't be from Raleigh. Yeah. Like, we have to find people in communities who say, I'm going to work with you, Jen, but I'm going to work here because this is where the work has to happen, right? And so I really want to find, and you guys probably know who it is in Winston, but there's always someone who knows everybody, who knows all the kids, who knows the schools, who can really help us. I can't walk into Forsyth County and get parents engaged, right? It has to be from the inside. I can provide resources and goals and structures, but we need people in all our communities to step up and say, I don't know what it's going to look like if you're going to be our liaison, if you're going to be an employee, if you're just going to be, Jen's right hand in Winston-Salem. Oh, that's my left. But I am definitely 100% behind this idea of being intentional about engagement in our communities. And fortunately, I have great people around me like you too. I'm sure you'll give me some ideas, but that's important.
Yes, and we will. We're fighting for a strong community family engagement. We think it's important for community to have agency. And as you said, that's where, that's where we can really just get to the root of addressing a lot of these issues. So thank you. And with that, I will turn it over to Letha to close us out.
Hey, just deep appreciation for Jen and for the team here for putting this event on, for helping us and our community recognize, right, that the leading with Leandro and the promise of Leandro is something that we should all strive for and work to achieve. We recognize as the Every Child North Carolina Coalition that when public schools are shortchanged and not funded equitably, the biggest impact is on our student populations, and oftentimes those student populations are always already underserved in so many other ways. We do want to give a shout out to Jen, who has already filled out the candidates pledge. We have pledges on our website for advocates or community members, and we have pledges for candidates to support fulfilling the promise of Leandro. I'm going to drop the links to our toolkit and to the pledges in the chat, and we ask all of our participants tonight to click those links to read more about the work that we are striving to do in the great state of North Carolina, and to sign on to the pledge of Leandro, the promise of Leandro, to help us fight for fully funding education, our public education, to ensuring that our students, our children, right, our communities benefit from the public education that we all deserve, that young people deserve, but parents deserve in conjunction with their young people. Thank you all again tonight for taking time out of your evening to be with us, to listen to Dr. Jen Mangrum share with us her vision for a state superintendent and what she proposes to do to ensure that the promise of Leandro is fulfilled. And again, deep appreciation for you for being here with us and sharing space with us tonight. With that, we greet you all. Good night. Thank you.
Val. Hey, Val. Thank you, Janice.
Thank you. This is amazing. Thank you so much.
It was great.
Thank you, Jen.
There's Julia.
Thanks.
What did you just